On this episode of the Neutral Wisdom Podcast, Satanic Warlock Robert Shirley discusses dealing with mortality, the significance of Memento Mori, Memento Vivere, and is joined by Undertaking Satan's Grendal Deathhawk to discuss dealing with mortality, dying, death, and the funeral industry. You are listening to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast, a podcast dedicated to passing on knowledge and experience from a satanic perspective, hosted by Satanic Warlock Robert Shirley.
Greetings and welcome to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Satanic Warlock Robert Shirley, and our topic for today is mortality, dying, and death in the funeral industry, as well as the meaning of Memento Mori, Memento Vivere. We'll be dealing with the concept of our own death and some strategies to deal with that uncertainty. We'll also discuss the significance of the phrase Memento Mori, Memento Vivere, and how we can apply this in our daily life. After the break, the host of the Undertaking Satan podcast, Grendal Deathhawk, will be joining us to discuss dying and death from a satanic perspective. Grendal is a professional funeral director and will also pass along his experience and wisdom on what is definitely going to happen to all of us. So, why an episode on dying and death? Surely I could have come up with a far more lighthearted subject for an episode, right? Well, in creating this podcast, I come up with ideas for shows that I want to listen to. I wasn't able to find any that address the inevitable in great detail, so here we are. I figure that if I, already on the downside of life's hill and quickly picking up speed, am apprehensive and concerned about death, there have to be those of you out there with the same feelings. And who have you talked to about it? Anyway, we have a lot of ground to cover before the second half of the show. The article for this episode is titled Memento Vivere, Making Friends with Death. The Mortality Wall. We all hit it at some point in life. The awareness of the inevitability of our own death. Not as simple as existential dread, where one frets about the meaning of life. The mortality wall is where we realize it is all going to end, and there is nothing we can do about it. I hit the mortality wall in the middle of the night. Out of a dead sleep, I sat upright, shook my wife, and said, "I'm going to die." Her response was that if I didn't leave her alone and go back to sleep, that I would indeed die that very night. But I digress. Death was always something that happened to other people. It was way off in the distance, and I never had any reason to think about it. Suddenly, this is going to happen to me. To me! And to you too, by the way. I was overcome by waves of anxiety, fear of the unknown, nervousness, even terror. Since it isn't something I can control, and I have no idea what it looks like, I can't make sense out of that, and you're damn right it scares me. I had been unable to reconcile this nervousness for years, despite becoming a Satanist and embracing our philosophy. There was always that fear lurking in the background. Sure, I could put it off or think about other things, but it was always there, waiting to strike at any inopportune moment, most often while I was trying to fall asleep. Thanks a lot, subconscious. During the Warlock Academy, we addressed these issues while discussing the is-to-be. I reached out for some advice on making friends with death. The reply from Dr. Robert Johnson is some of the greatest wisdom I have ever received. The answer to your question is quite simple. As we hit the wall, we must be over-diligent in realizing we will die. So there's no time like the present to give and receive love, enjoy our passions, and don't obsess over things or people we cannot change. I wear a skull ring to remind me that this may be my last day. If not, I'm grateful for the next. The secret is to always keep the possibility of death at the forefront of your mind. Constantly. This way, the fear loses its grip and you enjoy life as it is, in the here and now. With those words in mind, I devoted myself to study and introspection in how to best make friends with death. The following has worked for me. Perhaps it can serve as a jumping-off point for your own personal work. Study the Church of Satan canon. Our canon has many references to indulging in this life. As Satanists, we know that this one life is all we get and we must live it to the fullest. As Anton LaVey wrote in the Satanic Bible, life is the great indulgence, death the great abstinence. Therefore, make the most of life here and now. Except that this is going to happen, because it is. And, short of cryogenically preserving yourself in a deep freeze, a la the Walt Disney myth, there's nothing you can do about it. It is truly an utter waste of time to think about it at all, let alone suffer fear over it. Whatever happens, is it really going to matter? Do you remember how you felt before you were born? I don't. So if death is like that, i.e. we return to that state, I probably won't care then either. Or have you ever undergone anesthetic for surgery? What do you remember about being under? Nothing, right? And how bad was that? By the same token, every time you fall asleep, you never know you've slept until you wake up. In both instances, waking up is the only process that reminds you you haven't died. If you didn't wake up, you would never know you existed in the first place. Get busy. Given that we don't know what we don't know, and we've determined that it's pointless to be afraid of it, the only thing we can do is get busy. Do something creative. Art, music, writing. Get some exercise. Do some physical movement. Learn something, a musical instrument, a craft, a trade. Use this one life we have to be productive. Don't come to the end with regrets of, I wish I would have. Remind yourself. Magister Johnson wears a skull ring to remind him of his mortality. I do the same, a holdover from my biker days, but I also have Memento Vivere as a tattoo. Get for yourself a symbol that triggers you to get out and do things before you no longer can. Every time you have a down moment, look at your reminder that it's going to end soon enough, and then get up and create and produce. Live it up. Have fun. If you have yet to hit the mortality wall, I envy you, but mark my words, your day will come too. It's far better to be proactive and deal with it than to be reactive and realize it's too late. Make friends with death now, and you can smash right through the mortality wall without a second thought. Memento Vivere. Remember, you must live. That's a much heavier article than what I usually write, but there's so much more to it than I could cram into a mere essay. That feeling I described in the beginning of the essay didn't ever really go away. There were times, just random times, where it would cross my mind, and again, I'd get that feeling in the pit of my stomach like I'd just been kicked in the groin. Very unpleasant for all you female listeners. I'd also get feelings of abject terror keeping me up at night, or keep me very unfocused if it hit during the day. I'd eventually try to forget about it, and it went away, for a while at least. It went on like that for years, and then in one of the Warlock Academy classes, Magister Johnson said those magic words, "You have to make friends with death." That really resonated with me. How does one make friends with death? How does one actually reconcile the fact that this is really going to happen? How did he do it? I reached out to him for a little more clarification on that statement and to ask how he made friends with death, and he came back with that great advice from the essay. It didn't solve my problem, but it put it into perspective, and that's what we all need, perspective. What I really gained and realized from his comment is that this is inevitably going to happen, so that is actually the part we must face. Not so much the actual death part, but the feeling of doom that we cannot avoid the dying part. It's like getting a prostate exam. Just wait till you hit 50 and the old check engine light comes on for you fellas. It's going to happen, and it's probably for your own good. But you'll spend weeks or months worrying about it, not wanting to go through with it. But you will, because you have to. And after it's over and you're sobbing quietly in the corner, feeling all violated and used, you realize it wasn't really as bad as you thought it was going to be. But you don't ever want to have to go through it again. All doctor's appointments are like that, right? Just checking for a friend. But anyway, yeah, the fear of death is just like that. I referenced in my essay that we are literally going into nothing. Some may call it oblivion. Nothing is a highly subjective term. We don't know what it is, or maybe we do and we can't describe it. Or maybe it's just that, nothing at all. But how would we know then? I've also heard it said that we came from nothing and we go back to nothing. So maybe we should look at life as a vacation of sorts. A vacation from nothing. You know, it really does sound dumber when I say it. But look at it this way. When you go on vacation, you don't focus on the end when you have to go home. I did this on vacation once, and it sucks. It completely ruined my last few days. There was an impending doom cast over those days, and it was really hard to enjoy my time in my vacation spot. Have you ever tried to swim with the dolphins when all you could think about was having to head back home to 8 feet of snow? Well, me neither. I was too depressed. When you go on vacation, you try to cram as much fun into the time you have as you can. Every day is jam-packed with rest, relaxation, and the things you enjoy doing. Some of us wish we could be on vacation full-time. Welcome to Satanism, kids. That is exactly how we see our lives. We try not to focus on when the vacation ends, but instead we cram as many fun things into our lives as possible. Why focus on the end? We know we're going to have to leave eventually, but if we focus on that, the rest of the vacation will suck. That's a really good segue into Memento Mori, Memento Vivere. We have to focus on living, not dying. That brings us to Memento Mori, Memento Vivere, which, as I mentioned in my essay, I have tattooed across my chest. And yes, it did hurt like hell. The phrase comes from Latin, and according to Latin scholars, is not entirely correct. The two Latin phrases, properly put together, would most likely be Memento Mori ut meminaris vivere. And to those Latin scholars, it should be painfully obvious that I do not speak Latin, but hey, I gave it a shot. Remember that you will die, so that you will remember to live. Memento Mori is a phrase most people might be familiar with. Every goth and emo kid this side of the Mexican border most likely has it tattooed somewhere on themselves. It's cool, edgy, gothic. The Masonic Order, too, has adopted the phrase. Essentially, it means, remember that you must die. In his guide to Stoic philosophy, Meditations, Roman Emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius writes, you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. Okay, right? If you get hit by a train tomorrow or die in some bizarre gardening accident, what unfinished business are you leaving behind? Live every day as though it were your last. Not with a lot of screaming and crying, but by living your life to the fullest. Go on that hike, book that trip, tell someone you love them, and put the fucking gaming controller down, unless that's how you would spend your last day on Earth. Life is short, and we should never forget that fact. We don't know when our own will end, or those that we love, for that matter. Memento Vivere means, remember that you must live. This phrase reminds us that while we ought to consider the brevity of life, we also need to hold that knowledge with how awesome life is when we remember to live it well. Memento Vivere is the perfect motto for the Satanist. Squeeze every drop you can out of life. Go after the things that bring you pleasure. You only get to do this once. You only get this one vacation. Are you going to sit down and cry about having to go home at the end of it? Again, in my horribly butchered Latin, Memento Mori ut meminaris vivere. Remember that you will die, so that you will remember to live. Have I made friends with death? Well, not really, but at least I won't cross the street when I see him coming, because that prick is going to follow me if it's my time to go with him, whether I like it or not. But hey, at least I'll be able to show him some incredible vacation pictures, won't I? Before we go to a quick break, I do want to say that this is a fascinating topic for me. When I first graduated from college, my intent was to go into the funeral business. But apparently my wife, the inimitable Ms. Wiz, had other ideas about living over top of a funeral home in some small town, which is what I had planned. And so, thanks to Ms. Dream Smasher, I've had to funnel my energy into other stuff. Like a career where I have to deal with people who are able to talk back. I should have just gone to mortuary school. Let's take a quick break here. When we come back, we welcome Grendal Deathhawk of the Undertaking Satan podcast for more discussion on the topic of dying, death, and the funeral industry.
You are listening to the Neutral Wisdom podcast. For comments, questions, or suggestions, email information@neutralwisdom.ca.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Jack Hades here. Are you ready for the most exciting shopping experience this side of the mortal realm? Well, buckle up, because the Neutral Wisdom Shop is here to make all your buying dreams come true. Step right up and feast your eyes on the finest selection of goods you can find anywhere. From the latest in style and accessories to the chicest fashions of the season, featuring me, good old Jack Hades himself. The Neutral Wisdom Shop has it all. So, come on down to the Neutral Wisdom Shop, where every day is a happy day. Located at neutralwisdom.ca, right in the heart of darkness. We're always open for your business.
When you find yourself on the wrong side of the dirt, head to Neutral Wisdom Shop and buy a shirt.
Check us out at neutralwisdom.ca. We'll be waiting for you.
Welcome back to the Neutral Wisdom podcast. Our topic today is dying, death, and the funeral industry, and here to tell us more about that from a satanic perspective is the host of the Undertaking Satan podcast, Grendal Deathhawk. Welcome to the program, Grendal. It's a great pleasure to have you here today.
Warlock Shirley, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, your show is excellent. I'm quite the fan. I listen to it quite often, and I'm really happy that we're doing a little bit of a collaboration and get you out to a new audience. You know, it's great to have you here.
Awesome.
So for our audience who might not be familiar with you, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how did you become a Satanist, things along those lines. Give us the here's Grendal type of speech that you reserve for things like this?
Gotcha. Well, again, I am Grendal Deathhawk. Obviously, that's not a real name.
Get out.
I didn't think that'd ever be a problem when I chose it, but it has been, interestingly enough. As you mentioned, I am a Satanist. I am a member of the Church of Satan. I am a licensed funeral director in America in my state of residence. I also have a license as a embalmer in my state of residence. I've been in the funeral industry, I'd say now altogether for, I've probably said different things on different podcasts because it's hard to really remember, but I think 6 years. On the Satanism side of things, I got into it kind of in my formative years. I was in middle school, not exactly sure the exact age, but I remember going to class and we were studying a religious history sort of a project. And we did the big ones at the beginning of the week. And then the last day, we broke into groups and everyone was assigned to kind of do a lesser known religion, and you had to draw them out of a hat. My group did not get Satanism. We got Scientology, which was horrible. But there was another group that did get Satanism, and they did a presentation to the class. They did not do a good job at all. It was not accurate at all, but it was enough to get me interested. And that's really kind of where the rabbit hole began. I was in a very rural, small town. So this was kind of getting resources was always interesting. But yeah, so that's where it began. And then I didn't join the Church of Satan formally until I believe I was like 23 years old. I had completed my psychology degree, which was, I guess you could call my undergrad, what I did before I was a funeral director. Yeah, then just kind of breaking this on your podcast, not sure when it's going to air, but I've actually received communication from the administration that is looking good for me to be an active member and a spokesperson for the organization.
Congratulations, hail you. That's great news.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And yeah, paperwork hasn't come through yet, but hopefully it does and everything will be simpatico.
So that's your background in Satanism, but I mean, the big question is, how did you get into the funeral business? We talked a little bit earlier before we went on air, and I wasn't allowed, thanks to Ms. Wiz, and I'm only a little bitter about it, if you can't tell by my tone. So you went to college, obviously. Where I'm from, there's only one mortuary college in the entire country. And just for my own curiosity, did you start at the bottom? Did you drive the limos? Did you drive the hearse? Did you do the retrievals? Did you operate the retorts for cremations? When I looked into the business, they said, oh, yeah, you go to school, and then you come back and you start at the bottom. So I was just wondering how you started and where you got into it.
Yeah, it's very true about starting at the bottom. Really kind of when folks get into mortuary stuff, it comes from one of two angles. Either you're like born into it, your family is in the business, and then you just kind of naturally progress. Or the other thing that I see is that people from, let's say, tangent or parallel fields join up. I'm kind of from that boat in that I was working with the psychology side of things. I was doing grief counseling, and that led me to work inside of funeral homes with families for counseling services and things like that. And I hit it off with a funeral director at one of the places that I was working, ended up living above his place rent free. And then he said, I'll put you through mortuary school if you want. I took him up on that. I only got about halfway through before I found another job in the psychology realm of things that was more lucrative. So I went to that for a while. And then I returned and became the full-fledged funeral director. So I did the student stuff kind of beforehand, and then I came back, and now that's when I did the internship and all that stuff that you're talking about. To answer the question about being at the bottom, certainly, yeah, all of those things you've mentioned I have done. I've worked at multiple funeral homes during my tenure. One of the larger funeral homes that I worked at, I did operate the retort. They had their own crematory on site. I still drive cars and limos and wash the vehicles and mow the lawn, all of that stuff, because I'm in a much smaller firm now and it's kind of a one-man show, if you will. Mm-hmm. So yes, very much so. You talked about Miss Wiz not allowing you to be a funeral director. I'm the opposite. My significant other, I call her Lady Grendal. She is also a funeral director, and we live together at the funeral home and manage things together. So, yeah, complete opposites on that side of the fence.
Thanks for living my dream, man. Very much
You're welcome.
appreciated. One thing that I found that interesting that you said is that it's not lucrative. So if you could just dispel a myth for all of us, everybody thinks you guys are loaded, and it doesn't start out like that, does it?
No, not at all. We call that Cadillac chic, or something of that nature. There's kind of a term for it, black suits and Cadillacs. That's what people see on the outside. Obviously, we intend it to be that way. We want to act like classy folks because we want people to come and see us for their funerals. And I don't remember which episode it was specifically on the Undertaking Satan podcast, but I dedicated one to this heavily. So if you're an owner of a funeral home, yeah, you're certainly at least a millionaire. I mean, it would take $1 million in assets to even think about buying a funeral home of any size. But if you work for a funeral home, it's not that lucrative, really. I think upside of it is like 80 grand. I know some people personally over on the East Coast of America, like in the New Hampshire area, that pull down about 120 grand a year. But I'm nowhere near that. A lot of it's just choosing to work at a firm that's a lot smaller where I have more control. A lot of those jobs that I had talked about on the East Coast are working for giant corporations where you kind of are just a cog in the machine. So certainly not as lucrative as people think it is. I know that's one of the big myths out there, and a question I get a lot myself.
Yeah, just wanted to ask that question to kind of bust a myth and kind of open up the funeral industry for people who are curious but have never had to talk to an undertaker. So fortunately, you were there to answer that for us. So as you said at the top of the show, you're using a pseudonym for your anonymity. So is there no room in the funeral business for a Satanist? I know as Satanists, we accept that, even though we don't believe in a higher power, other people do, and we at least respect that. The second part of that question is, you cater to all sorts of people and their backgrounds. So do you have to be flexible when it comes to religion and religious beliefs? Do you have to conduct specific ceremonies or rituals for Muslims or Jewish people, Christians, of course, or can a funeral be one size fits all?
There's a lot to unpack there, but going back to kind of the first part of it, is there room for people, for Satanists in the funeral industry? The short answer to that is it depends on where you are in the world. There are Satanists in the funeral industry that are open. She's been very public, so I'll mention her name here. Kat of As You Like It Bath. She's been on quite a few satanic podcasts and has talked about things, and she's in a larger city. People don't really care in her neck of the woods, not a problem. I know a lot more folks who are Satanists that are somehow associated with the funeral industry that would never open up publicly just because it would hurt the business. Specifically in my area, if I were to come out, there's a large chance that I would be outright fired. There is a large chance that the funeral home I work for would lose business ad nauseum. So it really kind of depends on how open the place is that you are. For the second part of that question, talking about different religious customs and all of these things, and obviously I'm an atheist as a Satanist, right? I do work with all different types of folks. The most diverse I've been is at that large funeral home I mentioned closer to the top of the show. I did handle one Muslim burial. It's very uncommon in my area for funeral directors to really be involved with Muslim or burials at all, just because it's handled kind of inside of the mosque and kind of inside of the religious ranks, if you will. Jewish folks, they tend to have one funeral home in an area that they go to just because of religious practices associated with their death rites. Things like religious washing taking place in, I would say, a kosher room. So the funeral home itself may or may not be of Jewish ownership, but tends to be one in an area that knows how to handle things with Jewish deceased. And yeah, I've done a plethora of other ones. I've never done a satanic funeral. That's a question that I do get a lot. I have done multiple pagan funerals of different persuasions, and then I call them, the run-of-the-mill Christian ones, all the way from your snake handling Southern Baptists all the way up to your, traditional Catholic funeral. So I've done all of those things. I've officiated for Christian funerals, which is something people find appalling sometimes.
It's your job.
It's my job, and
Exactly.
I remind people that it's all about putting on a show. And there's a certain amount of glee I get in, the Satanist acting as a good Christian boy and doing the job. So, yeah, that's in a nutshell an answer to your question. I think I really enjoy studying different religions and different beliefs and different ideas about the afterlife. I'm a pretty intellectual guy who enjoys learning things about that. So that's how I sort of get around the negative associations that a Satanist would have about having to do those things. And also, if we're looking at the rules of the mastery of the earth, there's that old idea of when someone's in your house, you treat them well if they treat you well. And if you're in someone else's house, show respect or do not go there. I have that. I follow that to a T. When I'm in a Catholic sanctuary, I bow to the altar just like everyone else. But, if you go upstairs to my quarters, you're going to act in a satanic manner, or at least a respectful manner. So
interesting stuff, because saying that you bow to the altar is something I wasn't expecting to hear, but it does make perfect sense. So when you're holding these ceremonies or these funeral rituals or these funeral masses, do you ever have to take part as a participant in any of these ceremonies? And if you do, how does it work for you as a Satanist? Does it make you uncomfortable, or are you largely apathetic to what's going on? I mean, I do understand that you would have empathy for the family, definitely. But as far as the ceremony, do you just kind of zone out or just kind of keep your wits about you as to what's going on, or do you throw yourself into it?
I am interested in learning, like I said. So I'll give the example of a Catholic mass, like you just said, or mass of Christian burial for the technical term for the funeral. No, I do not participate in a Catholic mass, just because it would be very odd for anyone who is not a Catholic to have a part in the actual funeral service itself. Same thing with communion is taken, I think, as part of every single Catholic mass that I've been a part of. Funeral wise, I just do not take communion, but I will walk up and receive the blessing. For people who are unfamiliar, folks who are not initiated as Catholics are not allowed to take communion at all. So when they go up there for their, I call it juice and crackers, I cross my arms over my chest. That's what the priest asks you to do to identify yourself as a non-Catholic, and then they will give you a blessing. But they will not give you communion. So I'm working the funeral, so I'm generally in the back, making sure that the flowers are all right and everyone knows where the restroom is and the doors are closed so there's no sound coming in. So that's generally what I'm doing. But if I were asked to walk up and take a blessing, I certainly would, just because that's what the family asked me to do. And I'm in the house of the Catholic faith, and thus I will treat it respectfully, even if I think that it's complete bullshit.
That clears up a lot. And for me, I didn't know about the arm crossing thing. So that's good to know, because of course, even though I'm a Satanist, most people I know are still Catholic. But I appreciate you clearing up some of the things about your job and your career. And now kind of on to the meat of the topic. You are someone who sees death every day. So how do you deal with the concept of dying and death? Is it something that's on your mind, or does it not really bother you as a practicing Satanist?
So it's very interesting. I was reading the article that you mentioned at the top of the show, and it's I believe you called it the Mortality Wall.
The Mortality Wall, yes.
The Mortality Wall, yeah. Mortality. So it's interesting to me that wall exists for me still today. You would think that, I've interacted with literally thousands of dead human beings. You would think that I'm just used to it by now, but every once in a while, I still get that shock of like, there's a dead person there, and that means that I'm going to die at some point as well. Also, you put it beautifully in your article as well. I think about it as I call death stage 5 sleep. So normally you go down to stage 4. Death's just stage 5. I really think it's complete conscious oblivion. You have likened it to anesthesia. Do you remember what happened when you were under anesthetic? Of course you don't. Are you going to? I really do think that it's just complete black nothingness. So yeah, I do think about death a lot. I think probably more than most folks. But one thing that I want to drive home is that as a Satanist, we are about life and living. We do incorporate Memento Mori into our everyday practices, the skull and the crossbones, but it's not because we worship death or are any way excited to die or to make other people die or anything of that nature. It's just that in order to truly live, you have to run into that mortality wall over and over again and climb over it. And that's really what Satanism is about. So it's important that you at least come back and check on that wall every once in a while consciously, because it's going to run into you no matter what. So.
Absolutely. And it's still one of those things that still comes back every now and then. I mentioned in my talk at the top of the show, it's sometimes still like a punch in the stomach. It's still, oh, geez, it's coming. And it's funny because I don't think it's the actual death that everybody is afraid of. It's the doom that comes with being aware that we're going to die, that it's going to happen to us. I look at my dog. My dog just lives. She just lives. She's happy. She has no idea what's eventually coming. I would give anything to be like that, just oblivious to the fact that it's going to happen. And I think even for me, this show's kind of one of my ways of dealing with the mortality wall again. I think we're always constantly facing it and dealing with it in different ways.
Very true. Every culture has their own way of doing it. One thing with, and again, harping on Satanism again, but again, that's a perspective I'm coming from. You get those folks out there who say, well, why does Satanism need to be a religion? Why does there need to be an atheistic religion that's all about the carnal and the flesh and the happiness of life and indulgence? And that's the answer to the question is that that's your way of getting over the morality wall. Folks who just are atheists or, just or agnostic or don't think about it, they're just kind of running from it. And I think that Satanism is just one more tool that can be used to overcome that, because that is the one thing I think that all religions do, with the exception of Satanism. All religions in some way say that you're going to get an afterlife. It's a way to transcend death, if that makes sense. Now, of course, there's a lengthy list of laundry rules that you can and cannot do associated with those things. Satanism is the only honest religion who says, hey, there's nothing after death, but here's a list of things we can do to show you how to live the best life possible.
Live it up while we're here. So we're living the best life that we can. But do you have any tips for our listeners on how they should prepare for the imminent death of a loved one or for their own death? So what do you as a professional wish that people do or have taken care of before it's too late?
So I hate to be a greedy goblin, but please have the money in order.
No, that's great advice. Great advice.
Yeah, that sounds really, really cold, but I'm looking at it from the perspective of the family. When someone passes away and there's no money or there's nothing you can do, it's very difficult at the funeral home level to assist a family when they just don't have any means. Everyone seems to think that somebody's going to swoop in and save you. Again, I want to preface that I'm talking about America in my area of operation. I can't speak for elsewhere. But here, everyone thinks that the church is going to step in or that someone's going to pick up the tab. There are government programs, county burials, things like that, but they are not what people think they are. That's just for disposition in most places. So they're going to cremate you, and that is it. Not every county is that way, by the way, but the majority of them are. So having the financial means to handle things is very important. I do my best to save families money. I really do, but nothing is free. The follow-up thing that I always say is in America, if a person passes away and you're doing the traditional burial in a graveyard with a headstone and all of the stuff that's normally done, have $20,000 at the ready. Really, that's, you can get in under that. But when you factor in a headstone and all the things that you're probably going to want, that's the roundabout number that I would tell people to have set aside in a trust or just, within the family in order to handle things. it's nice to have a general idea of disposition, right? So if somebody wants to be cremated or buried at sea, or if they want to be composted, if they're in a legal area where that can happen, or if they want to go undergo water cremation or aquamation, that's good to know, because that's kind of the big topic that comes up first is how are we disposing of this person? And then the rest of it's kind of in the details. I have some general ideas of what you want written down for your family, and be able to pay for it are the two biggest things that I can do. Also, don't overplan. I come across pre-plans, which are what we call people who've come in and planned things in advance, that have their funeral down to the last song and how many memorial folders they want printed and all of this. It's worthless. Don't do that. Your family needs something to do, because getting through grief is an active process. So it's much better if the family has a hand in picking the color of the casket, designing the memorial folders, writing the obituary. So leave them some things to do is the last piece of advice that I would give.
Okay, and what's the most common method of interment or burial that you're finding in the industry right now?
So, as far as disposition is concerned, cremation is steadily on the rise. I believe that in America, it's probably 50 to 60% of everyone is cremated in some form. Burial would be second. And then in my area, really, I'm in the Midwestern United States. Those are kind of your two options. Some states allow, like I said, aquamation, which is cremation by using alkaline acids and alkaline stuff. I'm not too familiar with it, to tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. So that can be done here. Everything else that I mentioned really just isn't available in my area. Cremation in some form is the most common, followed by burial.
Now, I want to unpack something. I hope it's okay with you. I know a lot of our listeners never have to deal with this. I've never had to deal with it, so they may be unfamiliar with the whole process. Would you mind taking us through a walkthrough of what you do? So, for example, when you get the call for a pickup to the final disposition, it would be really helpful for us to know what happens kind of behind the scenes.
Well, it starts with the first call, which is what we call us being notified. This will come from one of a few sources. It can come from a hospital. It can come from a nursing care facility, or if a person dies outside of a medical setting, it'll come from a medical examiner or police officer. So you got to figure out where you're going. Removals can be difficult. They're easier if you're just going to a morgue in a hospital, and it's kind of like the movies where they pull out the tray and you slide the person over to your cot and then you take them on their merry way. Home removals are a little bit different, especially if there's no hospice involved at all. If the person's hanging from the ceiling because they've, committed suicide, or if I'm going to go back real quick. I don't like the term committed suicide, just because you have the right to your own life. You can end it if you feel like it. Satanism does not condone that, by the way, unless you're in immense pain and there's no way out, truly. So don't think that I'm encouraging that at all. But your life is your own. But I digress. So you could have a situation like that. You could have a 500-pound person in a basement in a bathtub that's been there for 4 weeks. So that removal is a little bit more difficult than everything else. Yeah, then you get the person back. If the family's there, you're going to, have a little chat with them. You're not going to bombard them with too much stuff. Basically, it's that big question that I talked about a little bit earlier. How are we disposing of this person? If they are burying them, or if they are cremating them, but they're having the body present for a service or a visitation beforehand, then I go ahead and complete the embalming process. For people who don't know what that is, it's removing the blood and injecting into the venous and arterial system a solution of formaldehyde that helps to preserve the body for longer and give you more time to work with. So then once embalming is complete, I generally go to sleep. And then
time for a break, yeah.
Yeah. Then I'll, call the family. If I haven't talked to them before, then this is the time. Well, let me go back. It's very illegal to embalm a person without permission. So
okay.
If I haven't talked to the person and I've done the removal, or their family, then I will call the family the next morning and then get permission to embalm and then do the embalming process. Very important to note. Once that has been taken care of, then I go into the arrangements with the family, schedule a meeting. This is where I go from weird, ghoulish guy into event planner mode. So this is, scheduling dates, figuring out officiants, figuring out what the person's going to wear, figuring out what floral pieces we are going to have, selling merchandise, caskets, urns, burial vaults, or outer burial containers is the technical term, and getting everything together. This is also where the legal stuff comes in. It's the funeral director's job to file a death certificate with the state where the person passed away, and then to cancel the person's social security number here in America anyway, via communication with the Social Security Administration. Then there's, a bunch of kind of writing the obituary, writing up notices, a little bit of digital design and printing comes in, a little bit of videography and, like PowerPoint slideshow stuff comes in. Basically just getting everything together that you would need for the service in question. Next step would be, once you get close to the date where the person's going to be viewed, you're going to be getting them dressed, casketed, cosmetized, which means putting on makeup. Most funeral homes do cosmetize men as well. That's another common question that I get. Everyone is shaved, not like, so if you had facial hair, like a giant, awesome beard, then we would save that, but all of the skin on the face will be shaved around it. Reason being that human beings have little microscopic hairs called lanugo that make it very difficult to put cosmetics on if a person isn't shaved. And then we do what's called the first viewing. Generally, that's where the family sees the person as they're going to be placed in state for the first time, which is kind of the most harrowing and stressful moment, because I want to make sure that my work is good on a mortuary cosmetic level. Once they say, yes, they look good, then I breathe a sigh of relief. If they think they look bad, I answer any questions on why they look the way they look and make any changes that are possible at that time. And then we generally go into something like a visitation, which is where people are standing around drinking coffee. This is also known as a wake, just kind of a social time where people familiarize themselves with what's going on. And then after that, if there's a religious service, that generally will take place either the same day or the next day as the visitation. Again, all this is different based on culture. And then it's disposition time. So that means in my area, burying the person, which taking them to the cemetery in the coach, which is the technical term for a funeral hearse, and getting them lowered into the ground, and then making sure that burial takes place properly. That's kind of all that she wrote, other than delivering flowers, communicating with the family for aftercare tasks, making sure everyone's kind of doing okay psychologically, chasing down money if a person hasn't paid in full yet, those types of things. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what it would like. And that's a longer or shorter process depending on what someone wants to do. If they want to be cremated earlier in that process and have absolutely no viewing at all, obviously that's a lot shorter.
That's the process in a nutshell. And I guess you're the first funeral director I've ever spoken with who is into psychology or has a psychology degree as well. I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about dealing with people who are in various stages of grief or under stress or distress over what's happened. Is it challenging for you to deal with this? Is the process more of a challenge for you to actually get to the next stage in the process?
Yes and no. I think my training in the psychology realm does behoove me. I think that it does serve me well. The biggest thing that you look out for when you meet with a family for the first time is shock. When people are in shock, they behave a lot of different ways, but they kind of have a glassed over look. They have brain fog. They're not remembering things well. That's one of the reasons that we kind of speak as briefly to the family as possible at the removal. I've had people, I'm in a full suit and tie at 2 a.m. receiving their dead one. I have an hour-long conversation with the person. We set up a meeting for arrangements the next day at noon so everyone could get some sleep. They come back and they don't recognize me. I'm wearing the same suit. I'm the same guy. But it's just they don't know who I am. I have to reintroduce myself and kind of start over again. There's certain people, when they're in shock, that they will change, their demeanor will change very, very quickly. So I've had a person in arrangements who spent half of it crying and half of it laughing. And if there was any other space in there, they were screaming at me. It's just really, that's the biggest thing you look for, is trying to understand when the family can absorb information and not trying to overload them, not trying to do too much too fast, is the biggest way that psychology, kind of serves me. As far as aftercare and things like that, I'm not going to lie to you, in the funeral industry, at least in America, aftercare in funeral homes is very, very lacking. You might get a call afterwards just to see how things are going on or going with the family. And then you might get like a Christmas card from the funeral home, right? That's kind of the end all and be all of aftercare. I think that there's a big market for aftercare in funeral homes. I think funeral homes should double as places to receive therapy. I think that there's something to be said for having therapists on staff. That's kind of my thoughts and how I personally deal with that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Just to lighten it up before we go, do you have any humor stories you can relate? I know there are plenty of books on the market full of anecdotes from, incidents with retrievals to problems with the coolers to issues with the retorts. Is there anything that you'd feel like you'd like to share? Maybe a little Undertaker humor?
Yeah. So when we had talked about this a little bit beforehand, and it's kind of difficult to pick stories that are humorous, just because a lot of times they're humorous in retrospect, because when they're happening, they're horrifying.
Yes.
Or you think that you're going to get sued. The one that I'm thinking of took place at a very large funeral home, and it takes a little bit of explaining. So sometimes a person is autopsied before they undergo embalming. And if that happens, then it's the embalmer's job to fix everything, get the organs back in place, and complete the embalming process. Part of the autopsy process is that they remove the chest plate. So the manubrium, which is the sternum, and the ribs are cut, and then the chest plate is taken off so they can then examine what's inside of there. Every once in a while, when you're reconstructing an autopsy, the chest plate does not go back in place just because the organs have swelled or something like that, and you just cannot get that chest plate back in there. Doesn't happen often, but sometimes it does. And the protocol for that is that you embalm that separately, which it's bone, basically. So you just cover it in formaldehyde powders and dry it out the best that you can. And then you would wrap that up and you would place it in some sort of box and put it at the person's feet, so that it's buried with them in the case of a burial. In this specific instance, that had happened. This was a large preparation room that probably did 20 embalmings a day. And the chest plate was taken out, put in a box, as protocol is. It was labeled with C plate that was handwritten on there. But a student had come in to the embalming room and seen that and didn't know what it was and thought that it was something that needed to be returned to the family. So they put that box with the flowers and everything that was going to be returned to the family. Thankfully, somebody caught it, and we got it back before the family could get that. I'm sure if that had happened, that funeral home would not be in business anymore. So that's kind of an example of something that was very, very horrifying and still is kind of horrifying, but it is sort of humorous when you think about it in an everyday light.
Do you find that you become a little bit indifferent to all of the icky things that people think about when they think about deceased bodies? Like, are you indifferent? Do you just, wow, this is my job, this is what I do? Taking all of the this was a person thing aside from it, just in dealing with the deceased, are you indifferent at all now?
I think that there is a level of grossness that you have to be okay with to be an embalmer or a funeral director. I think about it like, I don't know if you're aware of what's referred to as the untouchables in India. So there's, in the caste system in Hinduism, the lowest caste of people are known as untouchables, and they are people who are, they eat rats, they work with the dead, they do these types of things, and really that's the only jobs they're allowed to have. The reason I bring that up is that, to me, there's a certain amount of grossness that you just have to be okay with as a person. I think that I deal with it a little better than most folks would. When a person purges on me, which is the technical term for leaks on you or something of that nature. I kind of see it as like if I were holding a baby, an infant baby, and it spit up on you. Most people aren't going to like throw the baby against the wall and freak out, but I've seen many a mortuary student run out of the room if they get a little drop of something on them. So that's something you have to be okay with. It does take time to develop that. When you are dealing with decomposition and things like that, it takes time to kind of build up that metaphorical muscle, if that makes sense.
I cannot tell you how grateful I am to have had you on the program with us today. It exposed a lot about what you do. I think there was a lot of good advice in there for people, how to get ready, kind of what to expect. Before we let you go, is there anything else you'd like to share at all about today's discussion, about any of your current projects, and where can we catch the Undertaking Satan podcast?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, sir. I appreciate your invitation. It was wonderful. I'm familiarizing myself with your podcast when I'm enjoying it quite a bit.
Thank you very much.
I really enjoy the combination of writing and also the verbal aspect of it, and combining those two things. As far as myself and Undertaking Satan podcast, I have been taking just a little bit of time off. This is due to vacation that I've been on, and also work actually becoming extremely busy. So I am planning on dropping new things coming up in October 2024. It'll be a little bit different, a little bit of a different format. I'm not going to tease too much, but yeah, so that's when you can expect more from me. As far as where you can find it, it is housed pretty much exclusively on YouTube. However, I do have a landing page, which I believe is the undertakingsatanpodcast.com. And you can go ahead and look over there and get my links to all my social media. I am active on Instagram, on Facebook, on X, and also on Satanic for folks who are familiar with that. Yeah, I think that's everything that I've got going on Satanism / podcast wise.
Fantastic. I'll be coming to find you on all of those platforms now. I'm only familiar with you on YouTube, so that's great. And thank you very much again for being here today. Very much appreciated. And I think that will about do it for this episode of the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. Thanks to everybody for listening. And again, thanks very much to our special guest, Grendal Deathhawk of the Undertaking Satan podcast. Please drop a like or a comment down below. For questions or comments, you can email me directly at information@neutralwisdom.ca. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and anywhere else you get your podcast. Please check me out on Facebook under Robert Shirley and Instagram at @neutral_wisdom. And check out the new website, www.neutralwisdom.ca. Until next time, ever forward.
You have been listening to the Neutral Wisdom Podcast. For more information, email us at information.neutralwisdom.ca, Facebook under Robert Shirley, or Instagram at neutral_wisdom. Also, check out the website at neutralwisdom.ca. Program copyright 2024 Devilish Gentleman Enterprises.